And it's my pleasure in this second Cities at Tufts colloquium to welcome Kristen Jeffers. Kristen is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Black Urbanist multimedia platform, as well as being an author, textile artist, designer, urban planner, and activist. The Streets Blog network member and has also contributed articles to City Lab, Greater Washington, News and Record, Yes, Weekly, Grist, Next City, Better Towns and Cities, Triad, City Beat, the list goes on. And she's appeared on several NPR affiliate stations. And Kristen would like to highlight the resources page on her website at www.theblackurbanist.com/resources. Just a couple of housekeeping points. Can you switch off your camera if you're not presenting, which means everybody but Kristen? And keep the chat active. Megan will be monitoring the chat, so please keep the chat active. Kristen wants to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have an open session for questions. So again, welcome, Kristen, and we are eager to join you on a journey to a Black, queer, feminist, urbanist ethic and practice. Thank you.
Awesome. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, and for some reason the waiting room was still beeping on me, so hopefully that won't keep going through even though as I'm talking. I'm getting ready to pull up my screen here so you can take that journey with me. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not sure how to, hopefully the pings from the waiting room won't keep showing up over me. But anyway, I'm gonna, hold on, let me go back a slide. One thing I've noticed as I've done these Zoom presentations, as we've all lived in this world that we've been in, it's that a lot of the things I'm gonna be talking about today were already important, were already things we should think about anyway. And so that's why I'm going to take us through today. Once again, I'm Kristen Jeffers. It's an honor to be here with you this afternoon or wherever you are, if you're joining from a different time zone or if you're listening to the recording. And so there's three phases kind of today's talk that represent the three regions that I've lived in. I've lived in North Carolina, which those of you who may have looked me up or followed my work, all the way back to the beginning. And we're going to go back to the beginning in just a moment as I go through this blueprint. And then there's other phases that are a little bit shorter as I've started to live and travel and go other places. And that's infused this concept of creating a Black, queer, feminist, urbanist ethic. And that comes, the Black, queer, feminist, urbanist part comes from the fact that I do identify as a Black woman. I'm the descendant of enslaved folks and free people of color who lived in the Creeklands that became North Carolina, some of them amongst other indigenous populations, others of African descent. I am a queer woman, happily partnered with a lovely woman, Les, who is, I want to give her a shout out. She's amazing. And I'll talk more about how that's influenced and her thoughts and everything have influenced how I approach my planning practices to get into this. And then I like the word feminist, but it's inclusive to me of womanism, of just progressivism, just allowing and honoring the feminine persona, however it presents itself, the feminine presentation, and of course, acknowledging, in addition to other isms that aren't necessarily reflected here, classism, ableism, and I also still use urbanism because even though there are a lot of class and able things tied into that, I do want to emphasize that there's still value in talking about urbanization and using the short form of urbanism. So, and then of course, practice and ethic. You all are planning students or planning professors or just folks who are interested in creating a way to do what you do. And so this is going to be a journey into how I do what I do. And then I'm going to do some show and tell of some photographs. If I was with you in person today, that's what I would do. You'd have me over on the side, I'd be on the big screen and you'd see all these wonderful pictures of me over the years. And then I would go into zeroing in back on you and sharing with you the questions I've asked myself. If you want to dig even deeper in those questions, when you click on the resources page, these questions live in the questions to ask when thinking about a career in placemaking. And feel free to sub in whatever word uh, or type of planning, placemaking, urbanism, design, whatever it is that you want to do and you feel called to do. So let's get into what my blueprint was, the show and tell version. And hopefully I will be able to advance. Okay, great. So this is the where it kind of all began. This is, as I mentioned before, I grew up in North Carolina. And those of you who are familiar with our terrain know that we have urbanized, but in most situations, that looks like other people's suburbia. We grew up as a urban area much later, but we actually specifically in the what was called the urban crescent. I grew up in Greensboro. I went to undergrad in Raleigh. I lived in Durham for a period of time. I went back to grad school in Greensboro, and then I have friends and family and have traveled both out in and out of Charlotte. And then, of course, you have areas like Asheville, Wilmington that tend to be driven by their terrain and tourism. But we've all had agriculture, small scale manufacturing, and then just a lots of open natural space and all types of temperatures. And so for me, I was gifted with both of my parents living together. Now, later on, they were divorced, but that's kind of some of the things they overcame. They also overcame growing up in rural environments, growing up as, multi-sibling families, growing through and out of the Jim Crow South. By the time my parents reached middle school, high school, college, a lot of those separate doors and things started to fall away. And then they brought me home to this neighborhood. And there, if you actually look at videos of the terrain of North Carolina, everywhere from housing projects to downtown areas, you'll note that there's a lot of low density. And so there's a lot of folks at all income levels that have access to yards like this. Now, yeah, my mom was stay at home for a little while. My father worked in maintenance. And so in my household, education was really promoted. Exploring was promoted. In this picture here, I'm around 3 or 4 years old. And so that's my trike. That's my second trike that I've tied to my first set of bike with training wheels. And I'm pulling this along, and, I had the swing set. And then my dad, I told him I wanted to have a sandbox. Well, try to have a sandbox. And those of you who know, with cats, in or outside of a house, anything with sand in it's going to become their way of wasting or getting rid of their waste. So that's why that tarp is there. But once again, I grew up in an environment that encouraged innovation, encouraged being creative, encourage being able to have access to nature within our own home space. And of course, I have lots of, I'm an only child, but I have lots of cousins that were around my age group. I had some kids in the neighborhood who would come by and visit. The elementary school wasn't, both elementary schools that I attended were very far walks. One was about 5 minutes in one direction, and one was 20 minutes in the other. So growing up in an environment that allowed me to just be able to explore nature despite other privileges and other things that happen. Now, before I move on from this slide, I do want to mention that even though this looks idyllic and perfect and things are great here, unfortunately, I lost my father to a murder in this same house. Now, I was not there at the time. This was long after I was an adult. My parents are divorced, but as much as I have beautiful memories of this home and what it afforded me as a child and as a young adult, now, of course, there's also this idea of my father living in a home at the time that was not safe for him because there was a home invasion. He was not safe there. The neighborhood has changed demographics. People have not been given advantages. Even at this time, we should have had a full-scale supermarket around the corner from us, but it had closed years before. So by the time the neighborhood started to have residents that looked more like me, by the time that even the housing project, which was built for white folks, was mostly populated by Black folks and other people of color, things had changed. Moving on to maps have been a big part too. Now, of course, I live in DC now, and so the DC Metro map, I have way too many objects in this house that have this Metro map on here. My DC folks will know, and some of you can admit that you are in planning school because you were captivated by something like this that came from a town that wasn't yours, especially folks like me who grew up in smaller cities, smaller towns, even rural areas. Maps or a bigger airport or bigger like Broadway or just all these different things, cultural institutions, quirks would gave you this opportunity and this thought. And so already, my dad brought me my first box of maps home when I was 4. He, in addition to doing the electrician work, he did several things, but one of those jobs that he had when I was younger, he would buy maps from truck stops, bring them home, and we would travel all over. So already, and one of the things he wanted me to know is he wanted me to know how to read a map, and he wanted me to have like basic sort of handiwork skills. And mom as well. And I'll get to that because that'll kind of come into the end of my thoughts and the evolution. Then I was also encouraged by my teachers at a very young age to start writing. Part of the reason my work is so driven and rooted in journalism, rooted in writing, creative writing, thinking about the media, thinking about words, is because I, at the age of 6, well, in addition to my mom, that book on the right there is called My Special Mom. I did not have my mother's supervision or any teacher supervision really while writing this, which is why I think I took this picture maybe about 10 years ago. At this point, you can't really read the cover of the book because I drew it in crayon. Once again, I was in those classes, and I had that advantage and that privilege of being in those classes, even in what would have been known even in Greensboro as an at-risk school, but definitely a racially diverse and even if not an income diverse school, to have these opportunities to write. And so the book on the lower side, on the left side on the lower, was I won my first writing award. And it was the first time I would go onto the campus of UNC Greensboro, which would become another crucial point in the development of my practice and work. But right now, at 6 years old, I'm sending jams and jellies, and that reflection of growing up in a semi-rural environment, on trains and planes and walking, and the refrigerators in the apartment building and the cabinets in the apartment building. And so already at the age of 6, somehow, some way, I was melding and meshing and creating this environment where at the very least I was creating a Southeastern US, a Black Southeastern US, and some may say feminized domestic, honoring of traditional domesticity type of urbanism here. Then this is the school that I did middle school at. This is the school my mother worked at. So when my parents split, my dad still worked in the maintenance department at the school, but not this particular school. My mom taught at this middle school and thankfully did not teach me, but she was a presence in the building. If I got anything from my mom, my dad really instilled in me just this idea. You know, he was on the weekends I was with him, and other times I would be visiting various school buildings. He would take me to different sports games as a kid and upwards. And then with mom, once I got too old to go to daycare and a little too young to be part of some extracurricular activities, or if it was a day where I was not staying after school for extracurriculars anyway, and of course very little time of me being in detention, like just the thought of that would kept me in check, and there was really no misbehaving for me. So at Jamestown Middle in Jamestown, North Carolina, right between Greensboro and High Point, for those of you who know the geography. And so this is the second building. The first building is almost unrecognizable because it's now the high school that I attended. All of the campus is that. So just this idea of really, and this is something that I really felt when I came home last year to deliver a version of this talk, just the evolution of how communities are, how growing up, going through middle school, going through different life changes. I can say now that's when I started to know and a pinpoint that I was attracted to all different types of people, but I lived in a conservative, somewhat Christian bubble, and even still to this day, there's still parts of that bubble that still exist. So whereas I had friends and I was growing, and then I had teachers and a lot of things were opening up here. Of course, my mom's shadow also loomed in this building. And then once again, education has been a huge part, going to the library, respecting schools. I was going to college or doing something of the sort. There just really wasn't any question. So, but my mom gave me another gift. So, and I'll share that once again before I switch over to the questions I want you to consider. And then me personally, I really started to get into sort of the alternative scene. I couldn't put my finger on why, but of course I know now this is where I saw myself reflected in the alternative press. And of course, as was mentioned in the introduction, I have had the opportunity to present in several of these publications of the alternative press at this point. These reflect 3 of the cities that I've lived in. Unfortunately, Washington City paper, you won't be seeing a print edition every week anymore. It's going back to monthly because of the pandemic, but there's still one of the handful of people that the Indy Weekly sends me an email every day. It keeps me up to date on what's going on in the Raleigh-Durham area, even though I haven't lived there in over a decade. Yes Weekly is one of our 2 alt weeklies now in Greensboro. At the time, the alt weekly I actually grew up with was actually a conservative alt weekly, but it was one of the best places to get information about local government. The man who ran it took copious notes, and even when he had something to say to criticize the liberalness of the main daily, to this day his paper still exists. Now unfortunately he sold his paper to a major developer who he used to criticize, and I don't understand that logic. But the alternative press, the idea where I could open up these pages and I could see all types of folks of color, all types of people loving who they love and being who they want to be in their gendered selves, and all kinds of art and culture. And then of course some of the urbanism terms, even before I got access to that in other academic spaces, it was here. And then I also started dabbling. By the time I got to NC State University, I was already dabbling in campus media, and I'm a huge, huge music fan. One of the things I miss the most about this time period is that we do not have live shows like we used to. I've just started to ease myself into going outside on a daily basis and being able to distance myself and have air circulating, but I'm still haven't, I've not been part of these pilot concerts we've been doing here in DC. So I've been kind of going back in time myself and thinking about making playlists and spinning records. And I like to think of my work as like a mixtape, because not just because hip hop was in the shadow, jazz was in the shadow, gospel, all the Black American music forms were in the shadow of my upbringing, but just because I loved it. And I'm actually a 2nd generation WKNC DJ. My mom's brother DJ'd back in the 80s and not actually the 80s. And one of the handful of Black DJs then. I'm actually in the history books of WKNC because there's still only a handful of Black DJs that were at the station. So even in something as innocent as music and media, I was already kind of trailblazing and already put in a position just by existing on campus. I was also very active when I was on campus in the African American Cultural Center and we had the African American Symposium where we mentored. NC State, much like your institution, is a predominantly white institution, and so just being able to mentor students, Black students. We also had a version for our NC Indigenous students, and we still have a very, very large Indigenous presence, and some of those folks aren't federally recognized. So that was one of the few places where people could be recognized. And we actually already were kind of ahead of the game as far as thinking about how identities such as Asian ethnicity and countries we consider part of Central Latin America and the Caribbean ancestry overlap existing distinctions of indigeneity and Blackness and whiteness. So we were already a little ahead of the game. So our support systems reflected that. And even now, those of you who are looking for some other resources at other institutions, the African American Cultural Center, the Women's Center, and the GLBT Center at NC State have really made me proud over the years of thinking it through a lot of these things. Now, I was not on campus by the time a lot of these places really ramped up, but when I was on campus, some of them are really already setting the stage, in addition to campus media. And Speaking of textbooks, I don't know if anybody's been assigned this one. This one's a little bit older. I finished my graduate studies in May of 2012 at UNC Greensboro. Of course, the same institution where I won that writing award, and they had honored all the young writers in the Guilford County region. And honestly, I ended up at UNCG because they gave me the best financial aid package, plus I could live at home. And so, but they also had a concentration, their MPA actually concentrated in community and economic development. Under the old APA rules, that still would made me only eligible to sit for the test, like literally now. But under the new rules, they're integrated, we're able to have these integrated, you're here at this lecture, you're listening to this lecture today, and we're having these integrated and intersectional conversations around these things. But now this particular textbook I liked, this is, one of the co-authors is a Black male, a cis male, and then there's a woman, a white woman writing this, and there's a white man. And this is a textbook that's literally been written with some intersectionality in mind. When you open it up, you see all kinds of cities, all kinds of economic cities, but that was not the case with another textbook that I saw. And that's what's made me say, in the midst of even just getting used to being in grad school, going to grad school for the sole purpose of strengthening my journalism interest and media and communication interest and broadcasting interest, into creating something. And so I'd already kind of been, since the end of undergrad, I'd started a little professional blog called Waxing Philosophical. I wrote about a lot of different things, but it really, around the fall of 2010, being in grad school, it really centered in that I needed to be very clear about who I was. I needed to be, I wanted to create something. Of course, having had branding and PR training, I was like, I need to be clear. I need to put out something that makes me is exceptionally clear about who I am. And so that's where the Black Urbanist came in. Now, I am claiming my trademark in my region. I'm in the process of securing this, not to say that nobody else can call themselves a Black urbanist. It's a beautiful thing that people have adopted that terminology, that people are proud of being Black and urbanist, and distinguishing that urban is not just Black, and Black people aren't just urban, and that we're all different kinds of places and spaces. And even, this summer, of course, we've had a lot of chatter and talk about those things in this profession and in this space. But many of us, of course, have been at this conversation for a very long time, even longer than me. But this is where my contribution. And so this was the top of my site for a while, and I've kind of summarized a little bit what's written on this box here. That's the story. I pretty much tell the origin story of the site. And at this point, it was a site, and then I was in grad school and I was writing, but almost just a few weeks after starting, I had that article. I was approached by Sarah Goodyear, who at the time was writing for Grist. Of course, she's gone on to write for City Lab and the New York Post and do some other wonderful things. But at the time, I had started the @Black Urbanist Twitter account. We were 2 years away from Instagram at this point. This was fall of 10, so 2 years away from Instagram. And even for me, I didn't have my Apple set up. So and of course, Instagram and some of these apps tend to start on Mac and then they go to Windows. I was still operating on Windows. And of course, those of you who use your GIS software, that's pretty much where you still are. So I decided to start as a Tumblr, then I decided to get a WordPress site, and then I got the invite to write the Grist article, and then I got the invite to join folks and create this panel at the 19th CNU. And this was in Madison. Those of you who remember my work that far, some of you may even remember this panel and have been present at this panel. And I consciously put together a panel of multiple ethnicities and racial classifications to speak to how those different classifications and those relationships to non-whiteness reflected in urbanism at this particular symposia. What I did not realize was that I was creating a panel of mostly queer folks. Like, that was kind of an accidental thing. But clearly, even the things that are invisible sometimes have been invisible to me or even invisible to others have grown over the years. this is one of the first spaces I was already asking, okay, how do we compensate? How do we include? This was the diversity panel that year. This very well should have been like the lead panel. And of course, in the future, we're going to start seeing a lot of more lead panels that center intersectionality. It's just because this is life. You know, we've already kind of exhausted, in my opinion, these panels where we just talk about, you know, white cis male thoughts around planning. We don't really need any more of that, but we are still, the fact that we have a book called The Feminist City that just came out and it's a big deal. The fact that other folks in this industry, and I won't name names today, but you know who I'm talking about, can just write anything and it's just there. But when we write, some of the rest of us who are not white cis males write other things, it kind of has to come in the box of, oh, I'm this. And so even though I'm in the process of adding more things and adding more practice areas and adding uniqueness, and not just, obviously I'm going to talk about who I am and how that affects my planning. That's the part, and that's why you're here today. But really digging more into other things like, how does this affect what I'm doing? Dr. Robin Mazuda, and of course, congratulations, they've just been able to defend their thesis. They've been writing a lot on how mental health affects us, specifically as a non-white individual and specifically in the Canadian context. But once again, building these panels together. And then of course I've, by this point, and I want to make a note, we're still in the Greensboro era of my life. I'm still in grad school now. At this point, when 2015, I wanted to highlight the fact that I've been part of the Streets Blog Network for a very long time, and I've been featured multiple times, and I'm still technically part of the network. Anytime, if I ever post a blog post again, or my newsletters I know pop up over there, those of you who still access your planning news and information kind of in the old school way of going straight to Streets Blog, I'm still over there, and so many of us are, and that's still a nucleus. And that was a big deal because, once again, there weren't a lot of folks that looked like me, and still to this day, we're still in smaller numbers than other people on the site. And then getting to be inspired by and meet and encounter. And at this point, I've met both Dr. Mindy Foley-Love as well as Isabel Wilkerson. I'm looking forward to both new books that are out here, but I did want to highlight the originals, the OGs, if you still haven't read these two, or at least in the case, I have actually read portions of Root Shock because unfortunately I've lived Root Shock. And I've read all of Warmth. Warmth feels better for me. And I also want to highlight Chocolate City's The Black Map of American Life. That's the book that I'm going through in my book club right now. Some of you may be aware of my patron book club, but that's information now on the resources page. That's what I'm going through now. I'm going through these seminal texts by Black authors around Black placemaking. And these, in the case of Warmth of Other Suns, you started to see it more on anti-racist book lists lately. You're starting to see it, other designers and planners are getting a sense of reading it. But when you read these books and things like Black in Place, Franchise, and once again, that's why I have a book list of my own, because there's so many things. And some of you are reading these, some of you have already been assigned these, some of you who are doing your theses and beyond are doing these things. And of course, some of you may be watching, of course, who are writing these things. Being able to write, to me, being able to write where we can reach the average person is imperative. And that's what I love about these texts, and I love about these folks. They are reaching the masses. One other thing I forgot to mention, I decided to kind of leave the blueprint motif up here. So that's why you're seeing blueprint areas on there. So if anybody wants a copy of this without that, let me know at any point in time. So, and then tactical urbanism, I have had a chance through my workings and going to CNU since Madison off and on over the years to have had beers and drinks and have conversations with Mike Lydon and Tony Garcia, who are at least the recognized authors of tactical urbanism. But I know, as many others know, this is really just amplifying the block parties, the public art, all the things that we do from the grassroots to create places. And so this is a project created by some young professional leaders in Greensboro. Now, I wasn't on the planning committee for this, but when I found out they were doing it, I was like, okay, maybe I didn't get to plan this. Maybe this is a surprise, but I'm going to get involved in this anyway. I want to shout out Nadia Hassan, the designer of this, who we kind of touch base in another phase of my life now that I've gotten into my textile art. She was one of the first folks I knew who used a site called Spoonflower. And so that's what introduced me to that and introduced me to yet another phase of building my design practice. But this is, the color of this street is inspired by this, the lunch counters, the infamous lunch counters that started the Greensboro sit-in, which of course is recognized as kind of the showcase sit-in. And there were so many sit-ins across the country. There were so many public demonstrations against unjust civil rights laws. Of course, this, much like we're having this moment of marching, sit-ins, teach-ins, all kinds of direct protest action, this honors that particular direct protest action. And up until this year, this portion of the street was still very much active and in use. Now it's becoming a hotel, which is the drawback to a lot of our tactical and temporary urban illustrations. Now the organizers told the city that this was going to disappear like within a year's time. It actually has been, up until they started construction and up until this most recent resurfacing, has been there. But there are talks of painting another street. And of course, you know, we've experienced the summer of street painting, but this was 2013. We weren't quite there yet. We were honoring yet the most, up to this point, the most recent mass uprising, but this is 13. We're hearing about Trayvon Martin. We're honoring, by this time, Eric Garner would die the following year, but of course, there's been so many other deaths by police brutality and other activities that have created unsafe feelings for many marginalized people that we do and don't honor in these spaces. Then I have been honored to, even though I'm gradually becoming, I've just been truthful. I guess some would call that radical, but I've just been trying to be truthful as possible about who I am and how I am. Yet there are times when I get invites to be in rooms like CEOs for Cities. At the time, I was there on the strength of the Black Urbanist. I, at the time, had a different day job, but I was also doing this on the side, but I was known as a young civic leader. I was known as a rising star in Greensboro. I mean, if I hadn't needed that space to sort of grieve my dad, as well as give myself space to come out of the closet and emerge and even explore art and just explore living and traveling in other places, I probably would have been able to stay in this cluster of people. And of course, there's still many people. Of course, I got to kind of go back and thank them in person last year when I did a similar speech like this at home. But that I've been able to be in these kinds of environments. I've been able to be at the tables with mayors and DOT directors and all kinds of high level people. I want to give a shout out to Mitchell Silver, who's been a mentor and a friend for many years. And so there's been a lot of folks like that who have been listening. There's been a lot of people I've just been in the presence of who have had to listen to me, but I've had a chance to sit at a table and at least tell them and speak my piece. So that's also being able to have that advantage, and then also be recognized in the media as not as and of course, another thing I do is I try to highlight stereotypes. And so on purpose, I worked with a friend of mine who was a city journalist at the time. He approached me. Now, he was a little concerned that it would mess with my byline, but me being the mass communicator, creator, media entrepreneur, understanding that objectivity in media only goes but so far, I was like, let's tell this story. Let's feature me as a young professional. I commend him for and unfortunately, it's sad that he found a white homeless man. And of course, this was during the Occupy era a little bit as well. So it wasn't like people living in tents, white folks living in tents isn't something we haven't heard of. In Greensboro, we've gone through economic change. We've gone through outsourcing of our textile mills, our furniture mills. And so there are a lot of different people at a lot of different income levels and a lot of different ethnicities at home. And so this was a part of this, highlighting the different types of people that live downtown. But then I was also honored, and this is a Triad City Week, the newest alt weekly, and I was here representing a more activist spirit. Everybody on here is to this day still doing some kind of activism. Irving and April, who are the folks in the middle, have done some amazing things, especially April. Some of her work now through the Elsewhere Collaborative and other entities has been amazing. at centering and making people accept that Black queer feminism is very much still in Greensboro. Like, for a lot of folks, you know, I left and others have left. Others they may come out, they may be active while they're on campus and they move on. That's the case of the two of us on the edges of this picture. But for everybody else in the picture, they're still at home or at least the home they've adopted, on the ground, making change. And while we're here being recognized as the next Greensboro 4, of course, and this was in 2015 as well, we're also pushing forward to becoming we don't plan on being the last. And so and this is an Elsewhere collaborative project, and I wanted to put this up to show kind of how my life is starting to change by this point, after having been active and around different tables and protesting things like teen curfews, yet still being involved and invited to be in mass public spaces. I had the opportunity to, I was already kind of hopping out and away. Now, there's anybody who's familiar with Elsewhere's work and remembers this particular project, you know that there's another picture where we look closer together. It's kind of like right now we've been looking at all these social distancing pictures and everything and wondering, okay, where are they? Are they close, far away? But then you look at another angle and you're like, okay, well, everybody's far away enough. There's hope. We can be outside, we can distance, whatever, we can get over this pandemic. And of course, right now we need to take broader steps than we've been able to take, especially at the federal level. But I knew for me, I had to get out and away and move on. And of course, I do realize as I'm talking here, let me know if I need to slow it down a little bit. That's one of those things, is that when I start talking about my life and my practice, I just can't wait to share these stories. And I like to say it comes from the Southernness and the Black oral tradition of just carrying so much story and carrying so much spirit in me. So now we're at phase 2, where my first launch out of town is to move to Kansas City, Missouri, and help run the communications at Bike Walk KC. I do love cycling. I like walking a little better. And part of the reason is I learned that this beautiful bike behind me is not as practical as it needs to be for people. I learned so much during my time in Kansas City around what bike ped advocacy really entails, what it means, what it needs. And I had the wonderful opportunity. What I'm showing here is we created a women's bike summit. So a very feminist act in highlighting that even in a car dependent but legacy city like Kansas City, there's still importance in having a space to talk about women's issues. And so this was the inaugural summit, and the summit continues to this day. All these wonderful volunteers. Leslie's done a lot, who's standing next to me to my left, has done a lot of work with water access in a lot of different countries, and helped me find my next home when I decided to move to DC. And then getting on a transportation commission, like a city council commission in a whole nother city that I just arrived in after thinking that, okay, I'm moving somewhere else. I don't know. But so many of you are going to have this opportunity. So many of you are going to by virtue of you going to the school that you're going to, living in the metro area that you're living in, or at least going to school in virtually right now, being in these spaces, and when you move around, you're going to be extra mobile and you're going to be available to go around. And so for me, realizing that I could go in these spaces. And so this was one case. And then this was not only was this picture here represents an advertising opportunity that I coordinated, wrapping the front of the station, the baskets. I worked with the Jazz District, the 18th and Vine Jazz District that preserves Black music of the jazz era. And middle of the map is basically Kansas City's version of South by. And then this is the first day of having a Kansas City streetcar. And I had so many privileges around being able to get on the streetcar and work on bike ped stuff. And I was on the news several times for doing this. And it was just so mind blowing that folks chose me to do that. And then I moonlighted even in Kansas City. I was invited to help design a park in Birmingham. If you want to look up Pratt Park in Birmingham, I did the equity and the public engagement design on this project. And I was worried that we wouldn't build. Like many projects, we had difficulties, we had stops and starts. But it was working, and this was one of the first times I was working with other Black elders, and I wanted to, it was interesting. I let myself chastise them. I let myself get really into talking with them and um, hoping and praying even with them, kind of tapping into our faith tradition of hoping that these things will work out, and it has. And so you can see that installation. If you are, and if anybody's on here from Birmingham, you know, this was, and this particular picture was taken in, I believe it was this was also a 2016 picture by that time. Same with the streetcar was also 2016, but this was my first vehicle. The amazing feat is that I drove this vehicle from the time I graduated from undergrad until I decided to leave it parked. Well, actually, I got the opportunity to drive it to the Kansas City airport. And then I took my 4 suitcases out and I got on a plane and I flew to DC. And that's when I decided I was going to live in DC. Leslie, the person I showed you before on the slide talking about our Women's Bike Summit Day, had friends there. And so that's where I started. And part of the reason I felt empowered to just park my car at the time. Now I've since gotten another vehicle because I wanted to increase my mobility. And to me, we're still not where we need to be when it comes to mobility and feelings of safety and provision, such that women identified bodies, Black presenting and identified bodies, people of color, visibly gender nonconforming people, differently able people can have that safety sometimes of not having to use private vehicles, not having to use enhancements. I look forward to the day when we have electric bikes widespread, when the scooters work, when the bus comes 24/7 everywhere, when there's train service, when the sidewalks work, when it's lit in the right ways, when we are at that perfect intersectional urban space and place. But until then, I have had, you know, a complicated but very positive relationship with still having a driver's license. But my time in Kansas City, being on boards, commissions, but missing deeply the region of my birth and access and close access in the East Coast of being the connectivity, the transit connectivity, I basically decided to make the move to DC. And so that's where I am now. I've been here now 4 years. I thought I was just going to kind of retire from all of this. I was going to kind of create my own way. But reality is I got involved in doing this kind of work. And I know we're getting towards the time where you all have questions. And so I am, you know, found community and found my craft. Craft is what my mom has given me. So I'll go through quickly some of the things I've asked myself, and then I'll let you have your floor for questions. So basically, over the years, I've asked myself, what's my ultimate purpose? I've asked myself what specific skills I've wanted. I've asked myself what kind of work, employment, business, and like the specific legal, like who do I want to work for? Where do I want to do it? And clearly I've spent this 40 minutes talking about the wheres and hows and bouncing all over the place. And that process is still ongoing. How I want to do it, sometimes I'm doing it using fiber art. Sometimes I'm making these presentations. I've done it all types of ways and continue to do so. What do folks I know want from me? What is this story? And you've listened to me tell this story. You're going to get that opportunity to do that. I hope that everybody on this call as a student gets this opportunity to do that. And you're going to work on projects that have stories, just like you saw a lot of the projects I've worked on. They all have stories. So keeping in mind as you're building your practice ethic, of course, once again, this is my feminist, urbanist, Black, queer practice ethic, whatever yours is, and how it incorporates such ethics as, once again, I have a marginalized person's ethic. I think we should absolutely be incorporating that. And then how do I get the help? How do people remember? And then this is very important, the finances. Like literally this morning, I have had to sort through looking at the IRS, getting ready to pay taxes, not trying to go crazy. Take this time, and I know this is a scary period for a lot of us. We're seeing a massive economic change. I want to encourage you today to make it especially as students, continue to make a way to do the thing that you want to do, and think that through that money, and don't let the money stop you. Same any kind of external setback, namely COVID-19 or anything else. Do not let this stop you from creating your practice ethic right now. And then same with your health, as much as it's reasonable. Now, if you are recovering or you have anything else going on, be reasonable. Don't push yourself. Don't beat yourself up. I'm speaking to myself right now as well. Stay engaged, but do have a plan and think about that. And that's one thing I've had to ask myself over the years. And then finally, the last question I've asked myself, and I encourage you to ask yourself as you're building a similar ethic and centering your identities as appropriate in this, specifically my fellow marginalized intersectional folks, as you're centering your identity in your work, and as others who've been centered before are learning how to share and center and uplift. Think about those alternatives, because we all will have to consider alternatives, but that in that conversation with ourselves, we will find where we need to go. So with that, I will yield the floor back, and I still think we have some time for questions.
Well, thank you for taking us on your journey, Kristen. That is fascinating, a fascinating journey. And it just makes me think how, you know, we all need to reflect like that, how we got to where we are. Because you can only be true to yourself in practice, you know, if you really understand your roots. And I mean, to that, the first question, how did you verbalize the needs of your hometown community in the, quote, Southern good old boy network in those planning spaces?
Well,
I hope that means something to you, because, you know, as a Brit, it doesn't mean a lot to
me. Well, honestly, if you really study the South, the U.S. South, you'll learn that outside of Brazil, we have one of the largest numbers. Of course, you've heard about the Black Belt. We are large in number as Black people. So even though we may not be listened to, we have power. We celebrated the 103rd birthday of Fannie Lou Hamer yesterday, one of many women, Black women, who forced us to think about it whenever we didn't want to think about it. So it may be putting boots to the ground. For me, there were times I lost. Now, some of those CEOs for cities did not like it when I told them you shouldn't put out teen curfews. April, to this day, I commend her because she's boots on the ground right now. They didn't like it when she blocked Elm Street. They were like, well, we've just painted the mural, the second mural, the Black Lives Matter mural. Why are you doing that again? Because we need to. Because the paint is only one thing. Just like that road I showed you is going to resurface pretty soon. There are other things. I mean, we're literally talking about folks now, Guilford County and several other southern counties that are more bluer, and we do have blue counties in the South. We're seeing people be able to reach out. We're seeing less people in dire financial straits. Even our public housing doesn't look the same and isn't as bad a shape. But then in other places, it really gets down to that local thing, knowing who your people are, being willing and getting the support system around you you need to stomp into that city council meeting, or if you're the lead planner, draw the map the way you need to and fight for the map that you need. And especially if you have community behind you, or if you got into this because community has encouraged you, keep pushing.
Okay, so we've got about 5 or 6 minutes and 3 or 4 questions.
Okay.
So what does the term queer represent that is not captured in gay or lesbian?
So I basically I experience attraction all across the board. And of course, I also consider myself non-binary, but one of the things I've wanted to show is that non-binary, queer, pansexual, bisexual doesn't look a certain way, that you can have diversity in gender and sexual practice and thought and being, of course, being, and it doesn't look a certain way. So that's what that represents for me. And of course, if you go back to queer studies, if you go back to all the academics, if you really research that, they've got an even broader spectrum. And so my spirit of using that is in the academic spirit of broadening how we look at things and even how we gender objects and sexualize objects even.
Great, thanks. Can we claim to be rooted in place and also be transient and mobile? What makes someone a resident?
I think just caring and caring in a organic way, and learning when your caring doesn't necessarily make sense for what the community needs. Like, that's kind of what makes us transient in a way. Sometimes we need to move on. We need to, but we can, everywhere I've lived, I've been able to get involved in local government. I've voted in every jurisdiction I've ever lived in. I've cared, and I can't not care, because I don't know if it's just the Blackness, where we kind of have that solidarity, as you've seen. If you didn't see it before this summer, you definitely have seen it this summer, how we feel pain across the diaspora. And so it's kind of rooted in diasporas. If you're a member of a diaspora, you're going to feel some of that, regardless of where you are, I think. And then also just caring and listening and rooting in as much as you can. But then even if you uproot yourself, replanting yourself and doing the same thing.
Okay, the next question is about 5 pages long, so I'm going to ask the last couple of sentences. Could tactical urbanism support the decommodifications of housing?
I absolutely think so. I mean, it's all comes down to connecting with people, thinking about the economics. If it's in some places, it would be tactical urbanism, because it's just, you're not going to make it through the regulatory. And other places, regulatory is going to catch up to you. So anything like that, tactical urbanism or any other sort of trend, yeah, absolutely. It can definitely catch you up. It comes, once again, we're planners. It comes down to the plan, but don't forget your economics. Don't forget your community context. Don't forget your cultural competency in that.
Right. Well, Kristen, we're approaching the end here. I mean, on a personal level, and I'm sure on behalf of the 47 other participants, this has been a wonderful journey into you and your life. And I think more people ought to do this autobiographical, retrospective, reflective kind of thinking, because I think it really centers you, as it's clearly done to you. But can we leave you, or can you leave us? You know, here we have a mixture of students about to go 10 years after you did into the world. It's a very different world. What can you leave them with? What nugget can you leave them with, Kristen?
Just right now, I remember my last semester, I remember being lost in tests. I remember being lost in comps or whatever it is you got to do. I remember being lost in the job environment, but you still, your card still works for those discounts. So whatever places are still open that will let you order, take every student advantage you can right now. And that comes from calling people, asking people questions, getting those papers. Request every paper you think you might want right now, because it's going to get a little harder unless you manage to keep some sort of affiliation in the future, especially if you want to keep digging in. But take these questions and really ask them for yourself, and do it over and over again. This isn't a one-time thing. We have truly learned in this calendar year that things that we thought we wouldn't be talking about for years could just come to the forefront overnight. We literally have there's been so many things, from learning how diseases work, to shielding ourselves, to how we're going to recreate. I mean, I've changed my business model. I'm in the process of changing my business model right now. Be ready to be a business model. Be ready to be a social person. Be ready to be a rabble rouser, as it were. Just be ready, be rooted and grounded, and be ready and share. Definitely share, be in collaboration, fight your hardest, fight your ego the hardest to not fall into competition and feeling inadequate or feeling like things won't be good enough. You all have power in your hands, and it may be small, it may be a seed, but just plant it and watch and nurture it and let it grow.
Great. So UEP, be rooted, be ready, be a rabble rouser. Kristen, thank you so much. Can we all give Kristen a round of applause from UEP? Thanks so much. And Kristen, have a great day, and we'll see all of you at the next colloquium. Thank you.